The world had not yet burned. There was a moment, long and golden, when the Aegean lay still beneath the heavens, and the salt wind bore no omen. The bees in Attica hummed over olive groves without urgency, and the wide shoulders of Sparta turned beneath the sun, bronze and unbothered. It was the 5th century before the Christ child would be born, and 2 cities, proud as gods, stood watching one another across the waters, uncertain if they loved or loathed the reflection. Athens, Sparta, wisdom and war, sea and land, song and silence. The Peloponnesian War had not yet begun, but already history was holding its breath. Beneath the white columns of the Acropolis, poets still spoke of harmony and form, of man as measure, of theatre and thought and the perfection of things. Democracy, raw and roaring, danced through the assembly like wildfire, a young idea clad in marble. The people voted, shouted, exiled. And Pericles, that long-shadowed statesman, stood at the prow of the city like a helmsman steering a ship toward glory. To the south, beyond the mountains and the myths of Laconia, Sparta brooded, old as stone, spare as bone. It was a city of few words and hard hands, a city not ruled but trained. Its kings walked among spears, and its boys were raised not in homes but in silence and scars. They did not sing, they did not sculpt, they endured. For a time, they had stood side by side, Athens and Sparta, like wary lions, each helping the other pull Persia to the dust. Together, they had driven back the eastern wave at Salamis and Plataea. Together, they had sung the old songs of Hellenic freedom, their voices mingling like 2 branches in a single flame. But fire, once lit, does not long stay gentle. Victory breeds pride, and pride breeds memory, and memory, that fickle, aching ghost, soon begins to whisper, who truly won? And so it was that Athens, swollen with the spoils of empire, began to see herself not as first among equals, but as queen among subjects. Her Delian League, formed in fear of Persia, had become an empire in all but name. Tribute poured in from islands and coastlines alike, and the city grew fat on the silver of others. Marble gleamed, theatres flourished, temples rose like frozen thunderbolts against the sky, and Sparta watched. They watched as Athens built walls that stretched to the sea, unbroken, proud, a long white arm clutching her naval lifeline. They watched as fleets darkened the horizon, sails like ink against the wine-dark sea. They watched and said little, but sharpened. And still, the gods did not intervene. Or if they did so with masks upon their faces and riddles in their mouths. Perhaps it was Apollo, whispering into the ear of an oracle, warning of ruin in verse. Perhaps it was Ares, licking his lips in the dry heat of summer, watching men forget peace. Or perhaps it was simply the nature of power, that ancient, hungering thing, to rise and collide like tectonic plates, inevitable and deaf. By the year 431 BCE, there was no more room for caution, only accusation, only arms. Corcyra, Potidea, the Megarian decree. The causes are remembered, but beneath them, like roots beneath a forest floor, was something deeper. Fear disguised as honor, envy wrapped in speeches, pride so vast it swallowed diplomacy whole. And so they gathered. Sparta called upon her allies. Corinth, Thebes, the rugged lands of the Peloponnese. Athens summoned the Delian League, a fleet of nations lashed by tribute and promise. 2 worlds stood ready, one land-bound and austere, the other sea-born and silver-tongued. The war would last nearly 30 years. It would outlive generals. It would outlive Pericles. It would gnaw through the bones of Greece, one shattered polis at a time, until even the victors would wonder what had been won. But that was yet to come. Now in this first breath, there was only stillness, a waiting, A hush before the long thunder of history rolled across the Aegean like fate. There were children being born in both cities who would one day bury their fathers, not in old age, but in ambush and siege. There were temples being carved by hands that would soon grip swords instead of chisels, and there were prayers, soft and trembling, that the gods might stay asleep a little longer. But they did not. History began not with a battle, but with a whisper, and in the shadow of that whisper, the world began to change. Before the war, before the blades and blockades, there was a city made of dreams. Athens was not born in silence. She rose from myth, Athena's gift to the Attic plain, sprung not from womb, but from wisdom, armored and fierce. Legend tells us that Poseidon struck the rock with his trident and brought forth a spring of salt water. But Athena offered the olive tree, gnarled, enduring, full of oil and fruit. The people chose her, and in that choice lay a vision, not of might, but of meaning. The city cradled between mountain and sea began to breathe. In those early centuries, Athens was like any other, a rough tangle of farmers and families, stones shaped for shelter rather than beauty, kings remembered only in whispers. But in time, something stirred. A mind awakened. They began to speak not only of survival, but of justice, not only of lineage, but of logos, the word, the reason, the soul of things. A revolution without blood began to bloom. Solon came first, a lawgiver with eyes like thunderclouds. He unbound the people from debt, leveled the ground between tyrant and pauper. The soil of democracy was laid, not in sudden fanfare, but in quiet order. A code, a balance, a voice. Then Cleisthenes, breaker of tribes, reforged the city like a smith reforging bronze. He shattered old allegiances and made of Athens something new, a body politic where the demos, the people, would rule. The assembly rose like a second sun, and men who once bowed their heads now raised their hands in debate. It was messy, loud, imperfect, but it was alive. And from this cracked stone of politics came a flood of flame. Article drama, inquiry. The walls of Athens echoed not just with commands, but with questions. "What is justice?" asked Socrates, unshaven and barefoot, confounding the sons of senators. "What is truth?" mused Plato, gathering shadows in his cave. "What is the good life?" cried the poets in chorus, their masks like spirits, their stages like temples. They did not agree, but they did not stop asking. Here, philosophy was not retreat but revolution. The soul became a battlefield. Reason became its weapon. And while Sparta trained boys to endure pain, Athens trained minds to embrace paradox. They built not just walls, but words. Not just ships, but symphonies of thought. And yet, they did build ships. It is a mistake to think of Athens as only the cradle of philosophy. She was also an empire in bloom. The Persian Wars taught her that intellect alone could not survive without strength. At Marathon, Athenian hoplites drove back Darius. At Salamis, Themistocles, cunning, eloquent, irreverent, tricked Xerxes into disaster upon the sea. In that moment, Athens discovered herself, mistress of waves, defender of liberty, chosen of Athena. Her wooden walls, her triremes, became sacred things. They rode across the Aegean like thunderclouds, swift and oared and terrible. And so the Delian League was born, a pact, a promise, a protection against the East. But time made liars of such names. The League became tribute, tribute became tax, tax became empire. Athens, idealistic, brilliant, beloved Athens, became something else. She used the silver of the League to rebuild her city, to raise the Parthenon, to drape her streets in marble. Her pride was visible now in every column, every portico, every statue carved with serene disdain. And her voice, her voice, grew loud with destiny. Pericles stood at her helm, tall and measured, a statesman who wrapped ambition in reason, arrogance in logic. He spoke of Athens not merely as a city, but as a light, a mirror for all the world. Our constitution, he said, is called a democracy because power is in the hands not of a few, but of the many. And the people cheered. They believed him, but the islands and allies began to murmur. Beneath the glory, there was chain. Beneath the democracy, an empire ruled, and the sea, once a path to freedom, became a moat around a city that would not let others go. Athens had become the very thing she once defied, and yet still, she sang. Still the poets walked her avenues arguing over tragedy and fate. Still the philosophers leaned against her columns, eyes distant, hands drawing shapes in dust. Still the mothers taught their sons to speak with clarity, to vote with passion, to question even gods. Athens burned with mind fire, and that fire, like all fires, needed fuel. It fed on honor. It fed on fear. It fed on the need to be admired, to be remembered, to be right. And across the land, others began to flinch beneath the heat of her flame. Sparta most of all. The seed of war was already sown, not in one decree or battle, but in the unbearable brilliance of one city, daring to live by the laws of the mind, daring to lead not just armies, but ideas. It was unbearable. It was divine. It was doomed. And so the daughter of Athena stood tall upon her hill, surrounded by columns and chorus, girded in ships and silver, not knowing that soon her beauty would summon her ruin, not knowing that fire burns brightest just before it turns to ash. If Athens was fire, then Sparta was stone, not carved, not polished, but quarried from the mountains and set in place by the slow hand of time. She was not born in legend, but in endurance, not in words, but in silence. Where Athens asked questions, Sparta gave none. Where Athens raised her temples to reason, Sparta knelt to the unspoken gods of order and discipline. She did not glow, she endured. And in that endurance, she became unbreakable. Sparta lay in the south, in the valley of the Eurotas, cradled by the jagged Taygetus range and cloaked in the shadow of myth. But myth did not rule her. Law did. A law older than memory, handed down, it was said, by the semi-divine lawgiver Lycurgus, a man who may never have lived, but whose ghost governed more fiercely than kings. He gave Sparta a soul of iron. He took her gold and banished it, leaving only iron bars as coin, heavy, rusted, useless to thieves. He broke the old tribes and forged a new unity. He made every man a soldier, every woman a guardian of strength, and every child as ward of the state. In Sparta, the family was secondary to the phalanx. The home was smaller than the city. Love bowed to law. Boys were taken at 7, ripped from their mothers and thrown into the ago, the rearing, the grindstone of the state. There they learned pain like language, hunger like scripture, silence like virtue. They were whipped for weakness, praised for cunning, taught to steal, not for gain, but for survival. And if they failed, they were not mourned. At 20, they became soldiers. At 30, citizens. At 60, if they survived, they earned rest, but never glory. Glory was found only in death for the polis, only in that red silence of final service. The city had no walls. Our men are our walls, they said, and they believed it. Women in Sparta were not hidden away. They trained too, ran, wrestled, bore children not for beauty, but for strength. They spoke freely, sometimes sharply. They ruled their households, and in their bearing was a pride no Athenian could quite understand. Sparta had 2 kings, a strange arrangement, dual thrones sharing power, but they ruled little alone. Real authority rested with the Gerousia, the council of elders, and the ephors, overseers who watched the kings as closely as enemies. In Sparta, no one stood above law, not even royalty. And beneath this austere surface was a cruel truth. The Spartan citizen, the Spartates, were few. They stood atop a pyramid built on the backs of others. The perioikoi, free but voiceless, handled trade and craft, and beneath them, the helots, the conquered, toiled in endless submission. These enslaved peoples outnumbered the Spartans many times over. And so, every year, Sparta declared war on its own slaves, legally, ritually, to ensure control through fear. It was a city forever preparing for revolt, not from beyond, but from within. And so, while Athens built empires across the sea, Sparta built obedience into every breath. She did not expand. She did not sail. She did not dream. She waited. And she watched. Athens, in her beauty, was an affront to Spartan ideals. Her marble was indulgence, her democracy, chaos, her theater, corruption. Sparta saw her not as sister, but as sickness, a flame that would consume Greece if not checked. And Athens, in her arrogance, looked upon Sparta as a relic, ossified, unchanging, a city without art or song. She mistook silence for stupidity, simplicity for ignorance. But Sparta's silence was not emptiness, it was strategy. It was stillness before the spear. When the Persian wars came, Sparta led. At Thermopylae, they gave their dead-like oaths. Leonidas and his 300 holding back a tide. At Plataea, they broke the invader on open ground. The East was cast out, not only by Athenian cunning, but by Spartan resolve. But when peace returned, it was Athens who crowned herself victor. Athens who built, who ruled, who sailed. Sparta returned home and waited. She kept no navy, she minted no silver, she made no speeches, she preserved. For Sparta feared one thing above all: change. She had seen it before. How cities rise and rot in the same breath, how pride invites ruin. Her laws had kept her small, but pure, hard but incorruptible. And Athens, brilliant and blazing, was the very essence of corruption in her eyes. Empire cloaked in idealism, power hidden in philosophy. To the north, Thebes watched with envy. To the west, Corinth smoldered in rivalry. And in the center of it all, Athens and Sparta, locked not yet in battle, but in essence. Two visions of the world, two destinies. One must bend, or both must break. And still Sparta said little. She sent envoys, she asked for restraint, but she trained. Always she trained. Her generals spoke not of conquest, but of balance. Her kings did not dream aloud, but dreamed nonetheless of a Greece where Sparta's way, slow and eternal, would hold sway once more. War, when it came, was not surprise. It was culmination, the inevitable sound of two ideals colliding. But before the first spear was thrown, before the first city fell, there was this, the soundless, sacred chill of Sparta. Waiting in the shadows, blades cleaned, shields polished, laws intact. History calls her austere. But the truth is simpler. Sparta was afraid of becoming like the rest of us, and so she chose to become something else. And in that choice, she would either save Greece or burn it with her silence. It began as an oath. In the hush after Persia's retreat, the Greek cities gathered, not to conquer, but to protect. Burned temples still smoldered. The dead lay folded in fields that once bore grain. The east had been repelled, yes, but not destroyed. And fear, like ash, still clung to the shoulders of the Aegean. So the cities came together. On the sacred island of Delos, beneath the white sun and the quiet gaze of Apollo's temple, they laid their offerings. Iron, grain, ships, silver, whatever each could give. Here was born the Delian League, a mutual vow. If Persia rose again, they would rise as one. And at first it was noble, Athens was chosen to lead, not for ambition, but for memory. It was she who had burned at the hands of Xerxes, she who had stood fast at Marathon and turned the tide at Salamis, she whose triremes still cut the sea like knives through silk. The League gave her their trust and their coin. They called it tribute, a gesture of shared protection, a promise folded in silver. The treasury sat on Delos, tended by priests. Every city contributed, and every city had a voice. For a moment, it was real. Unity had taken shape, but the sea is a mirror, and mirrors distort. As the years passed, Athens grew stronger. Her navy, already unmatched, became colossal, a storm cloud of oars and bronze. Her generals, once defenders, became tacticians, architects of conquest cloaked in the language of security, and her tribute ships, once symbols of shared will, began to resemble tax caravans. Cities began to balk. Some asked to leave, some whispered of independence. But the League had changed. Athens did not allow disobedience. Naxos was the first to fall. They tried to secede, a quiet act of resistance. Athens responded not with debate, but with siege. Their walls were torn down, their fleet stripped, their freedom revoked. Then Thasos, then others. One by one, the allies became subjects. The tribute became tax. The treasury, once sacred and neutral, was moved from Delos to Athens herself. And the silver, once for ships and safety, was now for temples, theaters, and pride. Parthenon rose not from Athenian coffers, but from Delian coin. And the League, once a shield, became a chain. Pericles defended this with honeyed words. He spoke of unity, of beauty, of Athens as steward of Greek civilization. We use their money, he said, for their good. And in part it was true. The cities were safe. The Persians did not return. The Aegean was stable, watched by a navy swift and ruthless. But security at the price of voice is no true peace. And across the archipelago, resentment grew like moss, quiet, clinging, inevitable. Athens had become an empire in all but name. She stationed garrisons. She imposed coinage. She altered laws. Her ships docked where they pleased. Her officials settled disputes that were not theirs. And the League, still called a league, became a ghost. Only Athens spoke. Only Athens ruled. To those who resisted, she sent fleets. To those who obeyed, she sent stonemasons and sculptors, poets and philosophers, and reminders. The allies watched her festival of greatness with clenched hands. They saw the marble, the gold, the statues of Athena towering above all. They saw her agora bloom with trade, her stage thunder with plays, her democracy flourish in debate. And they asked quietly, where did our tribute go? They knew the answer, but rebellion was costly. For to resist Athens was to face her navy, her triremes, lean and fast, with 3 tiers of oars like wings of war. Her rowers were many, her generals shrewd, and worst of all, Athens believed in her own goodness. She did not conquer for pleasure. She conquered for order, for wisdom, for light. The most dangerous empires are those who believe they are right. Even Sparta, slow and landlocked, began to watch with unease. The balance of power, once so delicately held between city-states, now tilted heavily. Athens stood not as sister, but as queen, and where tribute was once shared, now fear was shared. The Delian League had become the Athenian Empire. Still, Athens told herself a story, that all this was necessary, that culture must have a center, that the Parthenon was not theft, but gratitude carved in stone, that democracy in one city justified rule over 100. But the sea does not forget, and the smaller cities began to whisper to each other, to Sparta, to memory. They remembered when the oath was sacred. They remembered when the League was a circle, not a wheel with a single hub. And they began to ask, not aloud, not yet, how long this illusion could last. In the shadowed halls of Sparta, where voices were few and memory long, the silence grew uneasy. News came not with drums, but with riders, dust-caked and bowed. They told of temples rising in Athens, of gold spent like rain, of cities punished for dissent. They told of tributes swollen into tax, of fleets swelling beyond need, of poets who praised Athens as a goddess and all others as shadows. Sparta did not speak, but Sparta listened, and in that silence, something old stirred. Not envy, not ambition, but instinct. The balance was shifting. The old order, built on shared wounds and mutual respect after Persia's wrath, had cracked. Sparta, once first among equals in strength and discipline, now stood in Athens' long and gilded shadow. She who had led at Plataea now watched as her former ally crowned herself Queen of Greece. And though Sparta had no appetite for marble or empire, she had one thing Athens could never take: memory. She remembered a time before glory, before Delos, before tributes, before the Athenian stage echoed with philosophers' tongues. Sparta remembered the ancient way, where city respected city, where gods watched over equals, where no one ruled but law. She saw Athens not as a tyrant, but as a fever, and fevers, left alone, burn. So Sparta began to speak carefully. Her ephors convened, their cloaks heavy with years. Her elders debated behind closed doors, voices low but firm. Her kings rode to the northern hills and listened to murmurings among Corinthian merchants and Theban warriors. And everywhere, the same word echoed: imbalance. The Greek world had tilted. Cities who once stood free now paid tribute in silence. Justice was spoken in Athenian accents. The sea, once open, now bore the owl of Athens on every sail. The Delian League, once pact, now prison. Sparta, bound by old law, had never desired the sea. Her might lay on land, her spears, her shields, her sons raised in silence and pain. She had no playwrights, she built no fleets of silver-tipped wood, but she had allies, and she had patience. It was in this quiet moment, a breath before the storm, that whispers became alliances. Corinth, rich but restless, chafed beneath Athenian dominance in trade. Thebes, ever proud, ever bitter, longed to rise. Even tiny Delium, even restless Argos, watched the horizon and wondered, what would Sparta do? And Sparta, she waited. But not all tension comes from the outside. Within her stone heart, Sparta too trembled. The Helots, ever beneath the heel, watched the world shift and wondered what it meant. In Messenia, revolt brewed like a coming flood. Earthquakes cracked the land, and with it, the illusion of permanence. The Spartan army, always watchful, turned its eyes inward, wary of rebellion among its enslaved. Sparta was strong, but brittle, bound tightly, perfectly by law and order, but stretch that order too far, and it might snap. So the ephors walked carefully. The kings rode more often, and the word war, once unthinkable, began to take shape not as prophecy, but as strategy. It began with allies. First, a city here, then another. Corinth made its case to Sparta, painting Athens as a usurper, not a partner. The Peloponnesian League, Sparta's own quiet alliance of landlocked power, stirred beneath the dust of years. It had no navy, it had no temples to wisdom, but it had swords and memory, and it had Sparta. Still, war did not erupt. Not yet. The Greeks, for all their pride, had seen too much death under Persian banners. They feared the cost. They remembered the fires of Sardis, the fall of Eretria, the ash of Marathon. They knew that war among Greeks would not be clean, but the ember was glowing now. It flickered beneath the surface of debate. It hid in trade disputes, in border skirmishes, in the growing number of cities who turned from Athens in quiet desperation. Athens, for her part, did not slow. Pericles, her silver-tongued steward, believed in order through strength. The navy grew, the silver flowed, the agora bloomed with new ideas. Sculptors chiseled gods from stone and playwrights stitched tragedy into myth. But all this marble sat atop a rumble. Athens saw herself as the sun, Sparta as the anvil, and Greece, that proud, fragile chorus of cities, began to fracture beneath the heat. The question was no longer if the war would come, but when, and who would strike first? Would it be Athens to preserve her empire, or Sparta to protect what remained of balance? Would it begin with ships, or a murdered envoy, or a city burned by proxy? The answer still slept beneath the olive trees, but the air was changing, and the gods, so often distant, began to watch once more. In the cool shade of olive groves, far from Athens' marble temples and Sparta's austere barracks, lay Epidamnus, a city small in fame, but large in its quiet strife. Nestled on the edge of the Ionian Sea, it was a place where the gentle pulse of daily life beat against the growing currents of history. Epidamnus was a city of farmers and traders, fishermen and smiths, a place where the scent of salt and earth mingled with the laughter of children. But beneath this calm surface, old wounds festered. Civil strife, born from rival factions within the city, had left its people fractured, whispering of exile and vengeance. In such fragile times, the city looked outward for aid. They turned to Corcyra, a powerful island state with a mighty navy, hoping for protection. But Corcyra's help came with strings, and soon Epidamnus found itself entangled in a conflict far greater than its own borders. Athens, wary of Corcyra's growing strength and eager to check Sparta's influence, saw in this quarrel an opportunity. They allied with Corcyra, sending their fleet to support the island. This move was not merely about Epidamnus. It was a gesture of power, a warning shot across the sea. Sparta and its allies watched, unsettled. In response, Corinth, an ancient city and proud member of the Peloponnesian League, took up the cause of Epidamnus, their kin. They opposed Corcyra's claim and Athens' interference, setting the stage for a broader confrontation. The stage was set not on the grand fields of battle, but in the salty winds of the Ionian Sea. The first clashes of triremes, slender warships with 3 rows of oars, echoed like thunder. The waves bore witness to the first blood spilled in what would become a long and devastating war. Small skirmishes grew into full battles, the sharp crack of bronze on bronze reverberating across the waters. What had begun as a local dispute had ignited a larger flame. Words grew sharper, alliances hardened. In Athens, Pericles defended the intervention as a necessity for peace, a stand against Spartan aggression by proxy. Yet beneath his eloquence, the city buzzed with tension. The people knew their future was being reshaped by these distant conflicts. Sparta, steadfast and stern, saw Athens' growing audacity as a threat to the fragile balance of power. The intervention at Epidamnus was no longer a simple quarrel. It was a breach of unwritten rules, a crack in the wall holding back chaos. The chorus of war was beginning to swell. Epidamnus itself became a symbol, not just of a city caught in turmoil, but of the entire Greek world's unraveling. Here was the spark that would fan into flames. A minor city, yes, but one that carried the weight of a continent's fears and ambitions. And as the skies darkened with storm clouds, the gods watched, silent but attentive. The wheels of fate, once set in motion, could not be stopped. And thus, from the salt and soil of Epidamnus, the Peloponnesian War took its first breath. The morning air was thick with salt and tension as fleets gathered near the Straits of Sybota, where land and sea whispered secrets to each other in ancient tongues. The Ionian waves, once calm and inviting, now bore the weight of wooden warships, their prows sharp as spears poised for battle. Here, two great naval powers confronted each other, Corcyra's swift triremes backed by Athens' burgeoning fleet and Corinth's proud vessels, defenders of the Peloponnesian League in the city of Epidamnus. The sea became a canvas for conflict, a place where oars beat like drums of war and bronze clashed against bronze beneath the harsh sun. The battle was neither swift nor clean. It unfolded in waves like the sea itself, surges of violence followed by moments of stillness, the spray of salt mingling with sweat and blood. Sailors shouted prayers to Poseidon, god of the sea, as ships crashed and grappled. Men fought hand to hand on decks slick with spray and fear. The cries of the dying mingled with the sharp cries of victory. Corinth fought fiercely, unwilling to relinquish control over their kin. Corcyra, bolstered by Athenian support, pressed forward with relentless fury. The lines blurred, allies and enemies caught in a dance of wood and metal. In the end, neither side claimed a decisive victory. The battle was a costly stalemate, but it sent a message clear as thunder to all of Greece. Peace was unraveling. The clash at Sparta was more than a fight for a minor city. It was the opening note in a symphony of destruction that would echo through decades. Athens celebrated its role as protector, its navy growing in confidence and ambition. Sparta and Corinth bristled with indignation, their warnings growing sharper, their alliances tightening. The tension spread like wildfire. Diplomacy frayed, trust cracked, and the world stood at the edge of a blade. Even as the ships withdrew, the shadow of war lengthened. The gods, silent witnesses to mortal folly, seemed to turn their gaze away, or perhaps leaned in closer, waiting for the moment when the flame would consume all. The ink of treaties was still fresh as Athens forged its alliance with Corcyra, a union not born of friendship but necessity. In the quiet chambers where decisions shaped destinies, whispers grew into voices and voices into declarations. The choice was clear. To stand with Corcyra was to challenge Corinth, and by extension, to challenge Sparta's authority. Athens, once a city content to guard her walls and cultivate her arts, now stepped boldly onto the turbulent stage of power. The Delian League's golden triremes cut through the waters, carrying not only soldiers, but the weight of ambition. It was a gamble, a slow tightening of a noose around Greece itself. For Corcyra, the alliance was salvation, a beacon against Corinthian wrath, a promise of protection in a world that had grown perilous and unkind. The island's silver sails shimmered with hope, but beneath that hope lay fear. The fear that this war, born far from their shores, would devour them whole. Across the land, other city-states watched, their hearts heavy with unease. Corinth's rage was palpable, a wildfire threatening to consume all. The Peloponnesian League stood firm, bound by blood and tradition, prepared to defend their honor against what they saw as Athenian overreach. In the agora of Athens, voices clamored, some for peace, others for war. Philosophers debated the nature of justice. Mothers whispered prayers to Athena. Soldiers sharpened their spears with grim determination. The fragile peace, held together by memories of Persian fires and shared survival, was unraveling thread by thread. And yet, beneath this fracture, a deeper anxiety stirred. For the Greeks understood, perhaps more than any other people, the cost of war. Not just in blood, but in spirit. The stories of heroes who fell, of cities burned, and of gods who turned their backs were woven into their very souls. Athens' decision was not merely political. It was existential. To protect Corcyra was to declare a new order, one where power and pride would determine fate. Sparta, watching from her mountain strongholds, tightened her grip on her own alliances. The Peloponnesian League grew wary, preparing for a conflict that no one yet dared to name, but everyone feared. The air was thick with tension, a quiet storm before the tempest. In this charged atmosphere, every gesture, every word, every raised eyebrow carried the weight of possibility and doom. Friendships frayed, old debts resurfaced, and the future whispered in riddles. The stage was set not just for battle, but for a reckoning. A confrontation not only of armies, but of ideals, memories, and destiny. And so, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the marble and stone of Greece, the world held its breath. The sun rose slowly over the Acropolis, casting long amber light across the columns of the Parthenon. Athens glowed, a city of marble and mind, of ambition and art. But beneath its radiant skin, the heart of the polis pulsed with anxiety. For even as the streets bustled and the port at Piraeus thrived with trade, a question echoed from symposia to assembly. Should Athens go to war? The war drums had not yet sounded in full, but already the air was heavy with the possibility. The alliance with Corcyra had drawn ire, and the recent skirmish at Sybota had rattled the old bones of the peace that remained. Corinth was humiliated. Sparta was watching. The Delian League held its breath. In the Pnyx, where the people gathered under the open sky to shape their destiny, voices rose like wind against the columns. Some cried out for strength. They spoke of honor, of empire, of the need to meet Corinth's aggression with fire. They pointed to the fleet, strong and unmatched, and to Athens' wealth, flowing from Delos like a golden river. They saw an opportunity not for ruin, but for greatness. At the center of it all stood Pericles, measured, commanding, the architect of Athens' modern soul. He did not hunger for war, but he understood its tide. His speeches held the gravity of prophecy. "Let us not act rashly," he told them, "but neither shall we bend to fear. If we must fight, let it be on our own terms, and for our own future." Others urged caution. There were the elders who remembered Marathon, Salamis, and the Persian fires. They spoke of the cost, not just in coin and blood, but in spirit. They feared for the city's soul, for the democracy that would bend under siege, for the minds that would dull under hunger and fear. Among them, a few dared to whisper that the Delian League had become an empire in all but name, that Athens was no longer a guardian of the free, but a master cloaked in noble words. These were dangerous thoughts, but still they stirred in the silence between declarations. In the taverns, on the steps of temples and beside the bustling markets, the citizens debated as only Athenians could, with words as weapons and ideas as shields. Artists painted war as glory. Poets hinted at hubris. Playwrights, cloaked in satire, asked, "Who benefits when heroes fall?" Even the gods seemed to lean in. Offerings to Athena piled high on her altar. The smoke of sacrifices coiled into the sky, carrying prayers for clarity, for strength, for peace, or for victory, if it must come to that. And yet, the path forward grew darker, not clearer. Corinth was agitating for Spartan intervention. Spartan envoys came and went, their cloaks stiff with silence, their eyes sharp. They listened more than they spoke, but their presence alone was pressure. The Athenians felt it. The city vibrated with that ancient knowing, that the peace was dying, and war was no longer a distant possibility, but a creeping inevitability. Pericles stood again before the people. "Understand this," he said, his voice low and firm. "We do not choose war because we want it. We choose not to bow. If we retreat from the world will not leave us be. We must hold fast, not for ambition, but for the city herself." There was silence then, deep and long. In that silence lived the memory of Thermopylae, the courage of Salamis, the morning songs sung for lost sons, and the quiet terror that all of it might come again. This time not from the east, but from within the very Greek world. The vote passed. Athens would stand firm. If war came, it would be met, not welcomed, but endured. And as the assembly dispersed and the city returned to its motion, a subtle shift passed through its streets. Blacksmiths began to forge more spearheads. Shipwrights slept little. Young men watched the horizon differently. Even the birds circling above the Acropolis flew heavier in the air, as if sensing the weight of the coming storm. Where Athens shouted and debated beneath the open sky, Sparta waited in silence. No applause echoed in her stone halls, no orators thundered on the steps of temples. Sparta did not speak. She watched, and she remembered. Surrounded by the dry hills and riverbeds of Laconia, Sparta remained a paradox. Still as marble, yet carved from fire. Its walls were not of stone, for as the old king said, Sparta's walls are her sons, her laws, her silence. The city was a hush of ritual and order. The agoge had shaped its people into instruments of endurance. Boys forged into warriors through hunger and pain. Men taught that discipline was dearer than gold. Here, war was not spectacle, it was duty. And now that duty stirred. Spartan elders gathered in the Gerousia, the council of age and wisdom. Their hair was silver, their words few. These were men who had buried sons without weeping, who had watched empires rise and fall like wheat before the scythe. They had seen Athens grow fat and clever. They had watched her send tribute ships across the Aegean, watched her paint herself as protector and liberator while binding the cities to her like vines to a stone. The Corinthian envoys came again. They spoke with fire, their voice cracked with shame and fury. They spoke of Athenian arrogance, of allies mistreated, of peace broken at Sybota and Potidaea. And they asked plainly, if Sparta is still leader of the Greek world, when will she act? The Spartans did not answer quickly. They turned to the oracle at Delphi. They listened to the wind over the Taygetus mountains. They prayed not for vengeance, but for clarity. For the Spartan soul was not impulsive. It was slow, deliberate, like the drawing of a sword. But in the streets, even the helots whispered of war. The younger Spartans, those raised not in memory of Persian fire, but in the long shadow of Athenian brightness, began to train longer, speak less. Their mothers sewed funeral cloths without comment. Their wives traced the names of ancestors in the earth. King Archidamus II, cautious and wise, urged delay. He had known Athens in youth, admired her learning, her theater, her ships. He did not want this war, but he saw the tide rising. War, he warned, is not something that comes when we desire it. It comes when it must, and when it does, we must be sure that we do not start it, but that we will finish it. Still the pressure grew. Allies pressed in. Corinth's fury burned. Megara wailed for her economic strangulation by Athens' decree. Even Thebes, cold and proud, leaned toward war. The assembly of the Ephors listened. They watched the omens. They watched Athens build. And slowly their silence became resolve. For Sparta was not a city that acted in haste, but when she moved, it was like a stone statue come alive. Sudden, inevitable, unrelenting. Messengers were sent. Shields were oiled. Spears were lifted from sacred racks. And though no formal declaration yet passed, the people of Hellas felt it, the quiet before the storm had ended. The lion had stirred from its cave, and somewhere, in the silence of a Spartan morning, a mother sent her son to train and told him, "Come home with your shield, or on it." For almost 3 decades, peace had rested like a fragile vase between Athens and Sparta, a vessel sealed in parchment, in promises, in weary relief after the First Peloponnesian War. They called it the 30 Years' Peace. It had lasted barely half that long. And now, The vase cracked. The cracks were not sudden. They had spidered slowly, invisibly at first. A quarrel over Corcyra, a siege at Potidæa, economic sanctions on Megara. Each act, a chip in the agreement. Each silence, a tacit drift toward rupture. Then came the ultimatums. Sparta, no longer content with watching, summoned the allies. In the great hall of the Peloponnesian League, words heavier than bronze were spoken. Corinth, still burning with indignation, hurled accusations at Athens. Imperialism, provocation, treachery. They urged Sparta to act or surrender her title as leader of Hellas. Other cities joined the clamor. Thebes reminded the council of Athenian arrogance. Megara begged for relief from the economic chokehold Athens had placed around her neck. A decree that barred Megarian merchants from all Athenian markets, shrines, and harbors. It was not war, but it was slow death. Sparta listened, and then she spoke. Her demand was simple, severe. Athens must revoke the Megarian decree, or there will be war. The message crossed the mountains and sailed across the wine-dark sea. It arrived in Athens not as parchment, but as prophecy. The assembly gathered. The people of Athens had long feared this day. The sky above the Pnyx felt lower than before, the marble steps colder. Some pleaded for compromise. To lift the decree, they argued, would be no surrender. It was but one law among many. Why risk all of Athens for the sake of Megara? But others, louder, prouder, would not bend. Pericles rose among them like a pillar beneath storm. His eyes, carved from carmine steel, scanned the crowd. "If we submit now," he said, "what message do we send? That any threat may move us. That fear shall rule the city that once stood against Persia." He spoke of legacy, of freedom, of empire and dignity. "We do not seek war, but we shall not kneel to avoid it." The people roared. The vote was cast. The Megarian decree would stand. The vase of peace shattered. Spartan envoys returned home with nothing. The parchment of the 30 years' peace, now mere kindling. And so the war began, not with a battle, but with a refusal. The spring of 431 BCE came with thunder, not from the sky, but from the marching feet of armies. The Peloponnesian League gathered like storm clouds, while Athens prepared her ships, her walls, her grain. Every temple was visited, every omen read. The Delian League's tribute flowed in, silver and blood. Citizens trained in the gymnasia, women stored oil and salted meat. Children were sent from the countryside into the city, and everywhere people looked westward, toward the isthmus, toward Sparta, wondering not if war would come, but when. In the fields of Attica, farmers whispered old songs, ones their fathers had sung before Marathon, songs of invasion, of standing ground. For this war, unlike those before, would not be a season of skirmishes or a theater of distant lands. This war would come home, to vineyard and hearth, to temple and shore. And so, as Sparta prepared to march and Athens prepared to sail, the Greek world held its breath once more. The gods, if they watched, said nothing. The fires were lit. The war, true, brutal, consuming, had begun. They came with spring, as sure as the return of swallows or the first unfurling of olive leaves. From the dry belly of the Peloponnesus, Sparta marched, not in haste, but in silence. Bronze gleamed under the soft sun. The land beneath their feet did not tremble, but it remembered. Archidamus II, king and general, led them not as a conqueror, but as a surgeon, precise, reluctant, deadly. His aim was not glory, but pressure. His weapon, not the sword, but time, hunger, devastation. And so the fields of Attica were the first to suffer. The Spartans did not storm the city. They knew its walls. The famed long walls of Athens stretched like arms, from city to port, from acropolis to sea. Their stones were thick with foresight, high with defiance. No Spartan force could breach them by strength alone, so they burned instead. Olive groves, centuries old, were put to the axe. Vineyards, heavy with green promise, were stripped and trampled. Wheat fields, rippling in the soft breeze, were torn and sown with salt. Smoke lifted into the sky like a dark hymn. Villages emptied. The people of the countryside, farmers, herders, craftsmen, fled to the city, driving goats, clutching children, dragging carts of tools and bread. Athens, the city of thought and song, became suddenly crowded with silence and fear. Behind the walls, they packed themselves like grain in a jar. Temples became shelters. Stoas became stables. The very air turned thick with the breath of thousands who had never lived so near the sea or so far from soil. But Pericles had foreseen this. He did not send soldiers to meet the Spartans in open battle. Not yet. That was Sparta's strength, not theirs. Our power lies in the sea, he reminded them. Let them burn our trees. They cannot reach our fleet. From the safety of her walls, Athens stretched her navy like fingers into the Aegean. Ships raided the Peloponnesian coasts. Athenian banners flew where no phalanx could tread. Grain arrived from Thrace, fish from Euboea, silver from the islands. And yet, the people suffered. Not from war, but from waiting. Athenians were not built for siege. They were built for agora and symposium, for drama and trade. Now, they lived as strangers within their own city, watching the horizon for fires, the harbor for ships, the sky for omens. Children cried in the night, asking when they could return to orchards now ash. The elderly murmured prayers to Demeter and Poseidon. Men grew restless, trained daily, argued often, drank more. Inside the Parthenon, Athena stood tall and gold and silent. Outside her temple, the people frayed. Pericles remained unmoved in policy, if not in soul. He walked among the tents, spoke with fishermen turned soldiers, heard complaints, praised endurance. But always, he warned, do not fight them where they are strongest. This war will not be won in a season. It would be a war of years, of attrition, of cities and ships, not just fields and swords. And so Athens endured, but not unchanged. Beneath the long shadow of her own stone arms, the city turned inward. Philosophy gave way to rumor. Theaters fell silent. The perfume of learning gave way to the stench of too many lives lived too close. Yet still, the ships moved. The treasury still weighed heavy, and the Acropolis still rose above it all, white and unshaken. The Spartans marched home, leaving Attica scarred and smoking. They did not take Athens, but they had delivered a message. Nowhere is safe. And in the stillness that followed, as ash drifted down like gray snow, both cities prepared for what they knew too well. The second year. For wars, once begun, do not burn like torches. They burn like furnaces. The year turned. The Spartans came again, this time swifter, with fewer words and harder hearts. The countryside once more became a canvas of ruin. But it was not Sparta that broke the body of Athens. It was something unseen. It crept in with the wind, or perhaps the cargo ships. A breath, a whisper, a sickness. The physicians could not name it. No prayer banished it. No rite slowed it. They called it loimos, plague. It began, perhaps, with a cough in Piraeus. The port bustled with sailors, slaves, strangers, all drawn into the city like water into stone. There, in the salt, heavy air, the sickness bloomed. First came fever, fierce and dry, like fire behind the eyes. Then nausea, then the swellings, then delirium, then death. The streets filled not with soldiers, but with bodies. The dead were wrapped, hurriedly, buried shallowly, or burned in haste. Rituals were forgotten. Temples became triage. Priests grew sick beside beggars. The gods, once so carefully honored, were now accused in silence. In the shadow of the Parthenon, no incense could mask the stench. Athens, proud and golden, became a tomb of the living. Pericles watched it unfold, powerless. He who had built the walls, who had warned of Sparta's might, who had ruled not by fear but by vision, now stood among his people, helpless before a fever. He did not flee. He visited the sick. He comforted the grieving. He remained among the infected, refusing to remove himself from the pain of the people. And then, the sickness came for him too. Pericles lost a son, then another. His voice faltered. His eyes, always steel, grew glassy with mourning. But still he stood, still he led, until he too, weakened, lay still. In 429 BCE, Athens lost not only its leader, but its spine. The plague spared some. Many survived, but none were untouched. The city changed. Men who once upheld law now looted. Women who once tended shrines now cursed the heavens. The citizen soldier, once the ideal of Athenian virtue, now turned apathetic or cruel. In the face of invisible death, the soul frayed. Thucydides, the historian who lived through it, wrote not just of fevers, but of a moral collapse, a kind of inward rot, as if the sickness had not only entered lungs, but law, not only bodies, but belief. In the great experiment of democracy, something faltered, and yet the city did not fall. Ships still sailed, taxes still arrived, the assembly still gathered. But it was not the Athens of Pericles, not the radiant city of marble and reason. It had become something else, harder, colder, hungrier. The war did not pause for the dying. Sparta still burned the fields. The allies still demanded protection. The empire still had to function. So the city, fevered and mourning, returned to the sea, to raids, to tactics, to surviving by motion alone. But beneath it all, a question grew like mold in the stone. What had Athens become? What are we when the noblest among us perish? What endures when bodies stack and names are lost and the gods no longer listen? The sickness lingered for years, returning in waves. Some said it was divine punishment. Others called it fate. But all knew this. Athens had suffered not just a blow to her strength, but to her story. The plague did not end the war, but it ended the illusion that Athens could remain untouched. The city that once sang with harmony now murmured in discord. Athens, fevered from plague and wearied by siege, found herself wrestling not only with enemies beyond her walls, but with shadows within. The assembly, the great heart of Athenian democracy, began to falter. Where once decisions were made with careful debate and reasoned voices, now the air thickened with suspicion, anger, and fear. In the agora, the market of ideas and goods, new voices rose. These were the demagogues, men skilled in stirring passions, painting enemies, and promising salvation with words as sharp as swords. They spoke of betrayal, of cowardice, of those who whispered peace with Sparta while the city burned. The people, still grieving, still hungry, listened. Leaders like Cleon emerged from the crowd, not born of noble birth, but of fiery rhetoric and relentless ambition. He condemned the cautious, attacked the moderates, and promised vengeance against all who doubted Athens' greatness. "We must fight," he declared, not with words, but with blood and fire. The assembly, once a place of measured law, became a stage for thunderous oratory and swift, often brutal decisions. Allies once steadfast began to waver. The Delian League, burdened by war taxes and losses, murmured discontent. Some questioned Athens' leadership. Others looked toward Sparta's shield as a safer harbor. In the city itself, fear bred cruelty. The infamous trial of the generals after the Battle of Arginusae revealed this fracture. The generals had won a great naval victory, but failed to rescue their drowning comrades after a storm. The assembly, inflamed by grief and outrage, condemned them all to death. Justice became swift, mercy scarce. This was a city unraveling. Yet beneath the noise and fury, old wounds bled deeper. The loss of Pericles had left a void, one filled by ambition but lacking his steadiness. The empire stretched thin, its sinews frayed by war and mistrust. Sparta, sensing Athens' weakness, pressed harder. But it was the strife within that threatened to break the city's spirit. As voices rose and tempers flared, the question loomed. Could Athens hold together when her soul was divided? Could democracy survive when fear and fury ruled? The war was no longer just between two states. It was a war within, a war for the city's very meaning. Far to the west, where the jagged Peloponnesian coast meets the Ionian Sea, a strange tide rose. It began as accident, as so many great shifts do. In the 6th year of war, an Athenian fleet, caught in a storm, sought refuge on the desolate shores near Pylos. There, the land was rough, stony, and poor, a place unclaimed, uncared for. But one among the fleet saw not just shelter, but strategy. Demosthenes, a general of wit more than wealth, saw the bay for what it could become. A dagger pointed at the Spartan heart. A fort was quickly raised from rock and timber. Nothing grand, just enough to stand. Enough to signal to the Peloponnesian coast that Athens was not content with defense. Sparta, upon hearing of the Athenian encroachment, sent troops, including their finest, the Spartans, to the island of Sphacteria, just across from Pylos. Their goal, to contain the nuisance, crush it if needed. But the Athenians did not leave. Instead, reinforcements arrived, and with them, strategy. Triremes blockaded the island. Supplies were cut off. The Spartan elite, marooned and encircled, found themselves in the most foreign position imaginable. Trapped. Sparta, the land of endurance, of never surrendering, now watched as its sons starved on an island. They offered peace. They negotiated. They begged. Athens, stunned by its upper hand, refused. For weeks, the stalemate continued. On the island, the Spartans, reduced to eating boiled leather, waited in sun and silence. In Athens, debates thundered. What should be done with such a chance? Then, in one swift assault, Demosthenes acted. A mixed force of hoplites, archers, and light troops, including daring rowers turned fighters, landed quietly at dawn. The terrain was rough. The Spartans fought like lions. But slowly, surrounded, outmaneuvered, and pierced by a rain of javelins and arrows, they faltered. And then, the unthinkable, they surrendered. 120 Spartiates, the iron backbone of Lacedaemon, laid down their arms and raised their hands. It was a wound deeper than battle. In Athens, the news fell like divine thunder. Women sang in the streets, men wept openly. Never before had Sparta suffered such disgrace. Statues were raised. The city that had buried sons under plague and fear now found her voice again. For a moment, Athens soared. She held Spartan nobles as hostages, a shield against further invasion. Her navy ruled the western seas. Her assembly basked in glory. Even her enemies hesitated. But victory, like wine, intoxicates. And intoxication clouds wisdom. Some cried for peace. That now was the time to end the war, to strike a bargain while Sparta limped. But others, emboldened by triumph, wanted more. Cleon, the same fire-tongued demagogue, demanded continued aggression. He painted peace as cowardice. He mocked the generals who hesitated, and the people, flushed with pride, followed. Thus, opportunity passed, and the war continued. Sparta, though humiliated, did not break. She grew silent, dangerous. She studied her wounds and whispered revenge, and Athens, instead of resting on the height she had earned, began to reach too far. Still, the moment at Pylos remained, a turning point, not only in war, but in myth. For it showed that even the unbreakable could bend, that the gods favored not just strength, but cunning, and that Athens, though wounded and weary, could still make history tremble. In the long reach of empire, temptation wears many faces, sometimes gold, sometimes glory, sometimes the soft whisper of an island across the sea. And so it was with Sicily. The island, vast and fertile, lay west of the known war. It was not part of the Delian League, nor bound to the feud between Athens and Sparta, but it was rich in grain, in cities, in mystery. To some, it was a far shore of peace. To others, it was opportunity. Among those who dreamed most vividly was Alcibiades, handsome, cunning, reckless. He was the ward of Pericles, the favorite of the people, and the embodiment of charm wrapped in ambition. Alcibiades did not merely wish to win the war. He wished to transform it, to make Athens not just a naval power, but a continental one, not just a beacon of democracy, but a master of the Western world. He spoke to the assembly in silver-tongued flames. Why fight the Spartans when we can outgrow them? Why defend our empire when we can expand it? He promised swift victory. Sicilian allies, cities eager to receive Athens, the wealth of Syracuse, the island's crown, ripe for plucking, and the people, ever drawn to the beautiful and bold, listened. Others warned. Nicias, old, cautious, weary of war, pleaded for restraint. "This is no neighbor's quarrel," he said. "This is not Ionia or Euboea. This is another world, another sea. It will drain us. It will bury our sons on foreign soil." But Alcibiades laughed, and the city, young, proud, wounded yet restless, followed him. A vast armada was prepared. Triremes gleamed in the sun. Sailors packed provisions. Priests gave solemn blessings. Poets sang of conquest. It was to be the grandest expedition Athens had ever undertaken. A display not only of might, but of destiny. And then, on the eve of departure, the gods were defaced. In the shadowy hours before dawn, statues of Hermes, guardians of travelers, were mutilated, faces smashed, phalli cut from the stone. Panic swept the city, omen, sacrilege, treason. Whispers turned to accusations, and all eyes turned to Alcibiades, the man of too much charm, too many enemies, too much noise. Some believed he had orchestrated the crime. Others said it was his rivals, seeking to stain his name before the great voyage. He demanded a trial immediately before he sailed, but the assembly delayed. And so the fleet departed, heavy with men, with glory, with doubt. The Sicilian expedition had begun. 1,000 ships, thousands of men, and the weight of a city's future surged westward, toward a land none truly understood. Alcibiades, brilliant, unpredictable, sailed as one of its leaders. Nicias, reluctant, prophetic, sailed as another. But even as the sails caught the Ionian wind, a different wind stirred in Athens. Warrants were issued. Alcibiades was summoned home, accused of blasphemy. He fled, not to safety, but, in the cruel twist of history, to Sparta. The golden son of Athens now stood beside her enemy, whispering secrets in Dorian ears, and the fleet, already far, already stretched, already unready for what it faced, sailed on without him. The Sicilian temptation was no longer dream, but unfolding fate. What Athens had imagined as a final stroke of empire was in truth a mirror, one that reflected the very flaws they had refused to see. Overreach, hubris, and the seduction of vision without wisdom. They arrived not as saviors, but as strangers. The Athenian fleet entered the great harbor of Syracuse with fanfare and confidence. Sails billowed like the wings of mythic birds. Drums beat, in rhythm with hearts full of conquest. The city lay before them, rich, proud, unsuspecting. But Syracuse was not Ionia, not some soft inland town ready to bow to empire. It was ancient, Doric, and proud, founded by Corinth, Sparta's cousin across the sea. Its walls were thick, its people seasoned, and behind them loomed a will far stronger than expected. The Athenians disembarked slowly. Nicias, cautious and burdened by foresight, sought to encircle the city with fortifications. Stone by stone they built a counter wall, a chain of ramparts to strangle Syracuse into surrender. But the Syracusans resisted. They counter-built, they rushed, they rallied. And slowly, the siege became a mirror, each side reflecting the will of the other. Then came Gylippus, a Spartan general sent across land and sea to answer the call of Dorian kin. Tall, fierce, and imbued with purpose, he stepped ashore not as an invader, but a deliverer. Under his command, the Syracusans rallied. Their city, once teetering, grew resolute. The noose Athens had hoped to tie now slipped. The moon hung heavy above the siege, silver, watching, unmoving. And in its light, fear grew. For the gods spoke in omens, and when a lunar eclipse darkened the sky, Nicias, devout and trembling, halted the retreat. "We cannot leave," he said. "The gods forbid it. We must wait the prescribed days." And so they waited. And in that pause, death crept closer. The harbor that had welcomed them now trapped them. Syracusan ships surged in, swift, maneuverable, striking like sea serpents. The Athenians, hemmed in and disoriented, faltered. One ship sank, then another. Men who had never feared battle began to fear water. The sea, once their strength, turned traitor, and on land the sickness returned. Not the plague of Pericles' time, but despair. Morale withered. Supplies dwindled. The enemy no longer feared them. Athens, who had once brought down Sparta's pride at Pylos, now stood broken before the towers of Syracuse. In a final desperate attempt, the Athenian navy tried to break the blockade. They painted their ships black. They readied every man, every slave, every rower, every horseman became part of the last gamble. The fighting was brutal. Wood splintered, water churned red, and the sounds of bronze and breath filled the harbor. But it was not enough. The Syracusans, driven by home and hope, closed in. The Athenians abandoned their ships and fled inland. Two armies, leaderless and exhausted, wandered the Sicilian countryside. Nicias, suffering from illness and age, led one group. Demosthenes, bold and tragic, led the other. Both were hunted, both were captured, and both, despite surrendering, were executed, against all customs of war. Their blood soaked foreign earth, far from the Acropolis, far from their beloved sea. 7,000 Athenians were marched to the stone quarries of Syracuse, deep pits with no shade, no mercy. There, they died slowly, over weeks, starving, parched, dreaming of olive trees and Aegean winds. Not a single ship returned. The entire Sicilian expedition, the largest and most ambitious military undertaking Athens had ever launched, was annihilated. Back home, silence. Mothers wept, fathers raged. The assembly stood paralyzed. The empire had not just overreached, it had shattered. And yet even then, the war was not over. Athens would fight on because pride is a cruel companion. But the soul of the city, its golden age, its dream of greatness, had cracked in the shadow of Syracuse. It was no longer a war of strategy. It was now a war of endurance. And history had already begun to shift. What do a people become when their gods do not answer? When their sons vanish into foreign quarries? When ships turn to cinders and the oracle's voice falls silent? Athens had not merely lost a war in Sicily. It had lost faith in its destiny, its invincibility, and in the very shape of its soul. The polis, once ablaze with confidence, now simmered with fear. And in fear, even democracies turn inward. They clutch old fears like weapons, and from within, the quiet hands of ambition begin their work. It began with whispers that the people were too soft, too ignorant to rule themselves, that demagogues had steered the city into ruin, that what Athens needed now was not open debate, but swift correction, order, control, a steady hand. Enter the 400. They were not soldiers, not saviors. They were elites, wealthy, educated, aristocratic, those who believed that power must belong to the few, not the many. They did not rise by violence. They rose by manipulation, slowly, legally, almost silently. Under the pretense of emergency, they dismantled the very assembly that gave them voice. They claimed to speak for the true will of Athens, the will not of the mob, but of the wise. And like a serpent that coils around its own tail, democracy was strangled by its own hands. In the year 411 BCE, Athens ceased to be a democracy. No soldiers marched in the streets. No statues were toppled. Instead, the city simply changed shape, and in that shape, there was silence. No more noisy votes in the Knicks. No more open trial or clamor of the marketplace. Only edicts passed behind closed doors. Only fear disguised as unity. The 400 ruled with trembling certainty. They negotiated secretly with Sparta. They spoke of restoring the empire through order. But the people, those not included, grew restless. At Samos, the Athenian navy refused the new order. They had not fought the Spartans, nor buried their comrades in Sicily, just to become tools of an oligarchy. They still called themselves democrats. They still bore the flag of a wounded, wandering ideal. From among them rose Thrasybulus and the exiled Alcibiades, who now sought redemption. The navy rallied. From the sea came resistance, a whisper of the old Athens, of open voice and fierce autonomy. And in the city itself, the 400 began to fracture. Some wanted to compromise, others clung to control. Their unity, always brittle, began to break. Soon the city echoed with tension, a clash at the fort of Phyle, protests in the agora, and the slow, rising tremor of a people remembering what they were. Within months, the 400 fell. Not with fire, but with disillusion. The people, cautious and scarred, restored a limited democracy. Not what it once was, but a return to breath. Yet something had changed. Athens had looked into the mirror of tyranny and seen a reflection it could not unsee. The ideal of isonomia, of equal voice, had been cracked. The seed of authoritarianism had taken root. Even as the assembly met again, even as votes returned and speeches rose like birds from marble steps, the shadow of what had happened lingered. And across the sea, Sparta still waited. The war was not done, but the spirit of Athens had aged. Its laughter came slower. Its songs were more like hymns. The bright flame of Pericles was now an ember carried by fewer hands. And the question now, for every soldier, every citizen, every soul in the polis, was not just can we win, but what are we if we do not? History has a cruel sense of irony, and no figure in the Peloponnesian War embodies it more than Alcibiades, beloved traitor, golden exile, restless son of a city both dazzled and wounded by him. He had once stood beneath the shadow of Pericles, whispering ambition into marbled halls. He had been Athens' brightest, most dangerous star, and then, in scandal and accusation, he had vanished. He had walked with Spartans. He had dined with Persians. He had betrayed, or appeared to. But now, in the dimming light of a fractured war, Athens needed something it had lost: charm, daring, brilliance, vision. And Alcibiades returned, not to the Knicks, not to the agora, he returned first to the sea. At Samos, where the navy had defied the oligarchs, he arrived cloaked not in shame, but in promise. He stood before weary captains and restless rowers and offered them not just strategy, but hope. He claimed he could sway Persia to their side. He spoke not as a man seeking forgiveness, but as one born again for this very hour. And they believed him. The ships that had drifted in confusion now cut through water with renewed fire. He led them in raids, swift and sharp. He sailed along the coast like a shadow, striking where Sparta thought Athens too weak to lift a sword. And the people began to murmur, "Alcibiades returned. Alcibiades for us." Even in Athens, where memory had once condemned him, his name grew lighter. What had once been treason was now retold as necessary exile, as cunning diplomacy. Time, it seems, forgives what victory justifies. In 410 BCE came the Battle of Cyzicus. It was a moment that tasted of old glories, a naval engagement where Athens triumphed utterly. Spartan ships were sunk or seized. Their admiral, Mindarus, fell. And from the field came a letter that would echo through the Hellespont. "The ships are gone. Mindarus is dead. The men starve. We know not what to do." Athens rejoiced. It was not merely a win. It was a sign. That fortune might still favor the daring, that the gods had not yet abandoned the city of Athena. Alcibiades returned to Athens at last, not in chains, but in triumph. The streets bloomed with cheering. Garlands were thrown. He was crowned commander. They gave him back what they had once taken, not out of love, perhaps, but out of need. And for a while, he served them well. He secured allies. He reclaimed lost islands. He walked through the streets with the confidence of one who had seen both exile and empire. But fate does not grant peace to such men. In 406 BCE, Alcibiades entrusted the fleet to sub-commanders and left to seek further aid. In his absence, disaster struck at Notium. A Spartan commander named Lysander shattered the Athenian fleet. And though Alcibiades had not been there, blame returned to his name like an old wound reopening. Athens turned again. His enemies, always waiting, whispered. The assembly stripped him of command. Again. He fled. Again. This time to a distant fortress in Phrygia, under the eye of the Persian satraps. A man who had once steered the tide of empires now watched from afar. In time, he would be murdered, not in battle, but in sleep. His house burned around him, arrows in the back. His end, like his life, chaotic and dramatic, somewhere between myth and tragedy. But even in exile, even in death, Alcibiades remained a mirror of Athens itself. Brilliant, divided, capable of greatness and betrayal in the same breath. His return had offered a glimpse of what might have been, a final turning of the tide. But the sea, like the city, remains unpredictable. Athens could no longer afford contradictions. It wanted victories without the cost of genius, and so it returned to war, without its brightest sun. From the quiet shadows of Sparta's Agorga emerged a man forged not by poetry or philosophy, but by iron and calculation. Lysander, a name that would become a whisper, a legend, a sword hanging over the fate of Athens. Unlike the fiery orators of Athens, Lysander's power was silent and steady. He did not seek glory in speeches or statues in the agora. He sought something far more enduring, control. With patience like a hunter waiting beneath olive trees, Lysander built alliances, weaving a network that stretched across the Aegean. He courted the Persian satraps with gifts and promises. Gold and influence exchanged beneath the trembling branches of ancient trees. He understood the truth that Athens had long ignored. War was not just fought with triremes and spears, but with wealth, with loyalty, with the hidden currents beneath the sea. In 407 BCE, he was appointed admiral of the Spartan fleet. His first victories were modest, yet each cut deeper into Athenian confidence. The Athenians, battered by defeat and political turmoil, struggled to respond. The city that once ruled the waves found itself pushed back, harbor by harbor, island by island. Lysander's greatest weapon was not just his fleet, but his mind. He chose not to fight with reckless courage, but with relentless calculation. His ships prowled the waters like wolves, striking when the enemy was weakest. In 405 BCE, at the Battle of Aegospotami, his patience bore its darkest fruit. The Athenian fleet, careless and complacent, anchored in a narrow river mouth, failed to prepare for attack. Lysander struck at dawn. With the precision of a master tactician, he unleashed his fleet. The Athenians scrambled. Ships capsized, men drowned. Navy and sailors vanished almost overnight. Only a handful escaped to tell the tale. Athens had lost its last great naval battle. The sea, once their cradle and fortress, had become their tomb. With the victory, Lysander did not just defeat a fleet. He shattered an empire's spirit. He moved swiftly to blockade Piraeus, Athens' vital port, cutting off supplies and starving the city. The walls of Athens, ancient and proud, now held prisoners, not victors. Inside, despair grew like a slow poison. The polis that had defined the ideals of democracy and freedom now faced the bitter edge of surrender. Lysander, cold and unyielding, waited, not for conquest alone, but for transformation. He saw the fall of Athens not just as the end of a war, but the end of an era where Athens' dreams of empire, freedom, and glory had collided and broken. The age of Sparta's silent blade had come. The dawn that broke over Athens was neither triumphant nor mournful. It was quiet, heavy with the weight of inevitability. The city that had once gleamed like a jewel upon the Aegean was now a shadowed shell, its mighty walls no longer a symbol of invincibility, but a fragile cage holding in a fading spirit. For nearly 3 decades, Athens had waged a war that had stretched the limits of endurance, a war that had carved deep wounds in its body and soul. Now, surrounded and starving, cut off from its lifeblood in the sea, the people whispered of surrender. Inside the agora, voices once loud with debate were hushed by fear and exhaustion. The great temple of Athena Parthenos, though still proud, seemed to weep in marble silence. Sparta's forces, led by Lysander, had encamped beyond the walls, their presence a dark tide swallowing every hope of rescue. The Athenians, broken by famine and loss, faced their fate. They sent envoys, humbled and worn, across the fields to meet the Spartans. The terms were harsh. The mighty walls must be dismantled. The fleet surrendered. Athens must submit to Spartan rule. To a city born of freedom and democracy, this was a death sentence, yet survival demanded sacrifice. The dismantling of the long walls, those massive ramparts linking Athens to its port of Piraeus, was a bitter symbol. The arteries of empire severed. Ships once proud and swift were now silent relics, their oars still as tombstones. Inside the city, grief hung like a thick fog. Citizens who had dreamed of glory now stared into an uncertain future. Some spoke of exile, others of rebellion, but most simply wept. The end of the war was not a moment of celebration, but a slow, collective exhale. A surrender not just of land or power, but of an era of ideals. Democracy itself trembled on the brink, yet even in this darkness, a faint ember remained. The soul of Athens, though battered, would not be extinguished. The lessons carved into its walls, its art, its philosophy, these would endure beyond the ruin. For history is not just the story of victory or defeat, but of memory. Athens fell, yes, but it rose again, not in arms, but in thought and spirit. And so, as the gates closed behind the Spartans, the city entered a new chapter, one marked by reflection, loss, and the slow rebirth of meaning. The dust of battle had settled, yet the silence that followed was heavier than any war drum. Greece, once a land of clashing shields and roaring voices, now stood shattered, a mosaic of broken city-states, weary souls, and faded dreams. The Peloponnesian War had carved deep scars into the earth and spirit alike. Villages lay deserted, fields once green now scorched or trampled underfoot. Families mourned sons who would never return, their names etched in the quiet corners of temples and homes. Athens, humbled and subdued, grappled with its new reality. The bright flame of its democracy flickered under the shadow of Spartan oversight. The long walls, torn down, left its people vulnerable. A city no longer armored for empire. But amid the ruin, seeds of renewal quietly took root. Philosophers like Socrates began to question not only the war, but the very nature of justice, virtue, and power. The tragedies penned by playwrights mourned the follies of pride and the human cost of ambition. Art and literature turned inward, reflecting a world forever altered by the cost of conflict. The Spartans, though victorious, found their triumph uneasy. Their rigid order struggled to govern a land fracturing at the seams. Alliances shifted like desert sands. Old enemies turned uneasy friends, and new threats loomed beyond the horizon. Trade faltered. Trust was fragile. Cities that had once risen in proud independence now eyed each other with suspicion. The unity that had once defined Hellenic identity was fraying. Yet history's wheel turns ever onward. The lessons etched into this era of hubris, loyalty, betrayal, and resilience whispered across generations. They echoed in the gardens where citizens once debated the fate of their polis, and in the silent stones of ruined temples where gods once walked among men. Though the war had ended, its stories endured, a reminder that even in darkness, the human spirit seeks meaning, justice, and rebirth. So, in the quiet aftermath, Greece began to breathe again, not yet whole, but wiser, not yet healed, but hopeful. The long shadows of the Peloponnesian War would linger, but so too would the promise of renewal. Time does not erase war, it reshapes it. What once thundered in the clash of bronze and the cries of the wounded softens into memory, into lessons passed down, not in orders and formations, but in stories, philosophies, and warnings. The Peloponnesian War did not end at the gates of Athens. No, it lived on, not in the ruins of city walls or the quiet harbors of fallen fleets, but in the mind of a civilization wrestling with what it had become. It was in the voice of Thucydides, the exiled general turned eternal witness, that the war began to take shape as something more than history, as a mirror held to the human condition. He wrote not for his time, but for all time. His words, cold and clear as mountain water, stripped away the illusions of nobility and revealed the grim calculus beneath empire and ambition. Through him, the Peloponnesian War became more than a conflict. It became a lens through which all future wars would be seen. No gods intervened, no fates delivered salvation, only men, flawed, proud, and fragile. Thucydides showed us that the war was not fought merely between Athens and Sparta, but between competing visions of how to live, between freedom and order, between idealism and realism, between hope and survival. And though Sparta emerged victorious on the battlefield, it was Athens, wounded, humbled, introspective, that won the longer war of thought. Its philosophers, dramatists, sculptors, and historians would shape the very soul of the Western world. From the cracked stones of the Acropolis, ideas were born that would outlive every spear and every king. Socrates, walking barefoot through the ruined streets, asked questions that pierced deeper than any arrow. What is virtue? What is justice? Can a wounded city still be wise? His student, Plato, carried those questions further, crafting a vision of reality that still echoes in every university, every republic, every court. And Aristotle, shaped by the war's aftermath, would go on to define logic, ethics, and governance for generations. This was the true legacy of the Peloponnesian War. It forced a civilization to confront itself, to peer into its own abyss and ask, what is worth fighting for? It taught that greatness built on conquest alone cannot endure, that walls, however high, do not protect a city from its own inner decay. And yet, it also revealed something enduring, that even in collapse, even in betrayal and famine and defeat, the seeds of wisdom may take root. That suffering can become song. That history, when held with honesty, can become guide and compass, not to prevent tragedy, but to understand it. So as the marble temples crumbled, as Spartan glory faded into rigidity and silence, as Athens rebuilt not its empire, but its soul, the Peloponnesian War became more than a distant past. It became a foundation, a whispered memory beneath the architecture of thought, a myth not of gods and monsters, but of men and their choices. A war that showed us what it means to rise, to fall, and to remember. History, when it speaks, does not do so in thunder. It whispers, across centuries, across borders, across the minds of men who build and break nations. Long after the last spear was cast into the dust of the Peloponnese, long after the firelight of Athenian democracy dimmed, another city was rising in the west. Rome, eternal and hungry. A republic, then an empire, a mirror, and in time, a shadow. The Roman mind, stern and legalistic, looked back across the wine-dark seas and saw in Greece a ghost, a civilizations of brilliance and ruin, of wisdom and hubris. And from that ghost they learned. Roman generals carried Thucydides in their saddlebags, not just for his chronicles, but for his warnings. The Peloponnesian War was studied not as distant history, but as living counsel for power and politics. The Romans saw themselves in Sparta, disciplined, pragmatic, ascetic. But they were drawn irresistibly to Athens, her arts, her speech, her soul. From her they borrowed philosophy, sculpture, rhetoric, and, more dangerously, ambition. Roman senators quoted Pericles in marble halls. Roman philosophers, from Cicero to Seneca, echoed the questions that Socrates first asked in the dust of a broken Athens. What is justice in the hands of the powerful? Can empire ever serve virtue? Even Rome's civil wars bore the scars of Greece's ancient lessons. Faction, pride, corruption, all these were known to the Athenians, and now they bled into the veins of the republic that followed. And when Rome, too, began to fracture, not from outside invasions, but from within, the ghosts of the Peloponnesian War stirred again. They reminded the world that no power is eternal, that every empire, no matter how mighty, carries within it the seeds of its own undoing. Yet in that echo, there was more than warning. There was also continuity. For though Athens had fallen, her ideas did not. They traveled in manuscripts, in temples, in the spoken word of poets, in the silent codes of marble. Rome became the vessel through which Greek thought reached beyond its own shores. And so the Peloponnesian War, though born in a narrow corner of the ancient world, grew vast in its consequence. It shaped how Rome governed, it shaped how Rome fell, and through Rome, it shaped the architecture of modern governance, the roots of Western law, the very questions that still haunt the hearts of nations today. Who should rule? How much must be sacrificed for glory? Can liberty survive ambition? These are not new. They were whispered in the halls of the Parthenon, and they were read by candlelight in the Senate of Rome. And now, in quiet classrooms and echoing courts, they still live. Time passed, and with it, empires fell like leaves in the turning of a long season. Rome, too, broke under the weight of its contradictions, leaving behind ruins and seeds. Centuries later, across the cold rivers of Europe and the mist-laced cities of the north, new awakening stirred. It did not march with legions nor sail with fleets. It kindled with ink, with argument, with reason. The Enlightenment, an age that reached back into the dim firelight of Athens and called forth its voice once more. In French salons and Scottish universities, in coffee houses and candlelit libraries, thinkers turned to the shattered fragments of Greece not as relics, but as instructions. Democracy, once a radical and ridiculed experiment, found new life in their dreams. They read Plato and Aristotle not as distant philosophers, but as guides on how power might be shaped by reason, how citizens might govern not with swords, but with discourse. Thucydides, grim and unblinking, returned too. His chronicles of war and decay seen not just as history, but as warning. In Montesquieu's theories of republics, in Rousseau's visions of the general will, in Locke's insistence on liberty and the social contract, the ghost of Athens breathed anew. They remembered Pericles, his funeral oration echoing not just in marble ruins, but in the preambles of constitutions yet to be written. "We do not imitate," he once said. "We are a model to others." Now, in the New World and Old, revolution stirred. In Philadelphia, they wrote of rights endowed by nature, of governments built upon the consent of the governed. They did not forget Sparta's order, but it was Athens' soul that lit their pens. In Paris, they stormed the Bastille not just for bread, but for dignity, for the dream that had once walked among the Athenian hills. Liberté, égalité, fraternité, echoes, ancient and bold. The Peloponnesian War was not forgotten, not in these new republics that rose amid fire and blood. Its lesson was clear: democracy, once born, must be guarded. Freedom is fragile when pride hardens into empire, when fear silences dissent, when the dream outpaces the people. And so the Enlightenment thinkers turned again and again to that war, not to glorify it, but to remember what was lost. Athens had reached too far, had burned too hot, but in her ashes they found a light, a moral imagination, a blueprint for reasoned debate, shared rule, and the dignity of citizenship. Not all was reclaimed. The wounds of empire and exclusion still mark the march of modernity. The new republics were imperfect, fragile, haunted by their own contradictions. But they remembered. They remembered Athens, not just as a ruin, but as a beginning. And so across the centuries, through war and revolution, from parchment to pixel, the spirit of that city walked on, wounded, unfinished, and yet unyielding. History does not sleep. It waits, silent and coiled, in the margins of memory. And when the hour darkens, when nations forget the fragility of peace, it stirs again. The 20th century dawned with thunder. 2 world wars would fracture the earth, would bury old empires beneath the mud of trenches and the roar of bombs. The machinery of violence had grown, but the questions remained ancient. What is power? Who decides the fate of many? How far will a nation go, not just to survive, but to dominate? The Peloponnesian War, its shadow long, its meaning reborn. In the war rooms of generals, in the writings of strategists, in the fears of philosophers, Athens and Sparta returned, as metaphor, as prophecy. When Europe shattered in the flames of World War I, many saw Athens in the optimism that preceded it, a belief in progress, in light, in unbreakable order. And they saw Sparta in the trenches, in the cold, unflinching logic of attrition, of sacrifice, of bitter endurance. But it was World War II that more clearly awakened the old ghosts. The rise of fascism, with its worship of discipline, conformity, and military might, echoed Sparta's darker legacy, stripped of its moral restraint. And yet democracy, too, stood on trial. In London and Washington, leaders evoked the ancient world. They spoke of freedom under siege, of civilization under threat. Winston Churchill, reading Thucydides, called upon the memory of Pericles, that frail, eloquent faith that liberty must be more than words. And once again, the world was split, between empires and ideals, between the fear of chaos and the hunger for order. After the war, as smoke lifted from the ruins of Europe and Asia, a new war began, one of nerves, of ideologies. The Cold War. Sparta and Athens reborn in the guises of America and the Soviet Union. The West, democratic but imperfect, invoked Athens, a beacon of individual freedom, flawed but self-aware. The East, collective and unyielding, echoed Sparta's unity and suspicion of luxury, its discipline, its sacrifice. Neither fit the old archetypes completely, but the mythic shapes endured, helping generations make sense of tensions too vast for statistics alone. And in classrooms and war colleges, the Peloponnesian War became required reading, not just for historians, but for diplomats, soldiers, and statesmen. Thucydides, once a general exiled by his people, now stood beside Machiavelli and Clausewitz. His ideas on power, the inevitability of fear between rising and ruling states, became known as the Thucydides trap. And some whispered, "Is history repeating? Is this how all empires fall?" And still, the questions pressed in. Can democracy survive prolonged war? What happens when liberty is compromised in the name of security? Does the strength of a people lie in their weapons, or in their willingness to reflect, to argue, to change? Even in the ashes of Vietnam, the dusty corners of Iraq, the digital battlefields of cyberspace, the dilemmas remained ancient, and always, the war between Athens and Sparta lingered, as more than a memory, as a mirror. The age of stone gave way to bronze, bronze to iron, iron to silicon. But still, the soul of history walked barefoot through our cities, its shadow long, its voice unchanged. In this digital age, where light flickers not from fire but from screens, the ancient questions return, wearing new faces, speaking in code and algorithm, but whispering the same riddles that once echoed from the walls of Athens and Sparta. What is truth when 1,000 voices clamor at once? What is democracy when power no longer wears a crown but a cursor? Can a people govern themselves in a world built to distract them? Athens, had it survived its long war, might have recognized the tension of the now, an open society, vibrant, brilliant, loud, forever at risk of tearing itself apart through too much voice, too little trust. For the Athenian ideal was built on debate, on a shared world of polis, on proximity, where a citizen stood among citizens, face to face in the theater of the assembly. But today, we drift. We type instead of speak. We scroll instead of listen. Our assemblies are scattered, and the threads of our discourse fray. And yet, this is not the end. The ancient flame has not gone out. It flickers in every protest, in every vote cast with trembling hope, in every call for justice sent across digital oceans. Democracy, like fire, requires tending, and like fire, it can burn or warm. We live in a time of fragmentation, of conspiracy and confusion, of manufactured outrage and deepening echo chambers. But so did they. Athens, too, was overwhelmed by its own brilliance. Too many voices, too much pride, not enough silence between the words, and Sparta, silent, ordered, austere, may have survived the noise, but it could not outlive time. Its stillness became stagnation, its obedience became ossification. So here we stand, in a new agora, lit not by torches, but by LED glow. The same temptations remain, the seduction of certainty, the hunger for control, the suspicion of the other, yet the lessons endure. From Athens, that freedom is not license but responsibility, that every voice matters, but not all voices are right. That truth must be wrestled with, not assumed. From Sparta, that discipline is not tyranny, that courage is born from service, that strength without compassion rots into cruelty. And from the war between them, the long, bitter war that claimed two dreams, we learn this: victory can cost more than defeat, and no ideal survives unless it is defended not only by arms, but by wisdom and grace and remembrance. In our world of noise, to remember is an act of rebellion. To study the old wars is to guard against new ones. To teach the Peloponnesian War is to teach the anatomy of collapse, but also the anatomy of hope. Hope that we might choose differently, that we might listen where they shouted, build where they burned, pause where they charged blindly forward. Hope that the city, whether physical or digital, might yet be sacred. The stones of ancient cities crumble under the slow breath of time, yet their stories remain, whispered by the wind through olive branches, echoed in the footsteps of pilgrims long gone, carved into the very marrow of memory. Empires are not merely built by armies or kings, but by stories, the sacred narratives we tell ourselves to give shape to our fleeting lives. The Peloponnesian War was more than a clash of spears and shields. It was a story about identity, about the fragile dance between power and virtue, about the ever-turning wheel of fate. Its battlefield lives on in myth, where history becomes legend and legend becomes mirror. Athens, the radiant city of light and shadow, taught the world how to dream of freedom, but also how to fall from grace. Sparta, the silent sentinel of order and sacrifice, showed the price of discipline and the cost of silence. Through centuries, poets and philosophers have woven these threads, from Euripides' tragic chorus to Plato's ideal forms to the Byzantine scribes who kept the flame alive in a darkened world. In the Renaissance, the revival of classical learning brought these stories back to life, not as mere curiosities, but as foundations for new worlds. They became symbols of rebellion, of tyranny, of the eternal struggle to balance freedom and order. The Peloponnesian War, once a grim record of destruction, turned into a cautionary tale, a sacred text for rulers and citizens alike. In the modern age, historians continue to sift through its ruins, finding new meanings in the dust. For memory is not static. It shifts and changes, colored by each generation's hopes and fears. In this eternal return, Athens and Sparta live on, not as monuments frozen in stone, but as living myths, reminding us that the fate of any empire is tied to the fate of its soul. We look back not to repeat, but to remember, to see the sparks before the fire, to hear the silence before the storm. And in this remembering, we find ourselves. The Peloponnesian War is not just their story, it is ours. Freedom, a word so simple, yet so heavy, it bends the shoulders of those who carry it. It is the breath of Athens, the pulse beneath its marble columns, the fire that lights the minds of poets and philosophers alike. But freedom is no gentle breeze. It is a storm, a reckoning, a relentless demand. To be free is to bear the burden of choice, to face the abyss of uncertainty, to wrestle with the twin shadows of fear and responsibility. The Peloponnesian War reminds us that freedom is fragile, that it requires vigilance, wisdom, and sacrifice. Pericles spoke of the city as a school of Greece, a place where the individual and the community intertwine, where greatness is born not only in conquest, but in the courage to govern oneself. Yet, when fear grows, when suspicion festers, the city fractures. Demagogues rise, words become weapons, The delicate balance shatters. Power, too, is a weight, not merely the might of armies or the clatter of gold, but the unseen force that shapes the heart and soul of a people. The struggle between Athens and Sparta was not just a war of men, but a war of ideals, a battle for the soul of civilization itself. In the end, victory was Pyrrhic, a reminder that conquest can hollow the victor. Mortality hangs over every empire, every hero, every city. The dust of Athens and Sparta mingles beneath the earth, yet their legacies endure. Not in stone alone, but in the ideas that outlive time. Meaning is woven from this tapestry of rise and fall, from the triumphs and tragedies, from the whispered prayers of those who longed for peace. As we drift toward rest, let us carry these reflections gently, like the soft weight of a candle's flame in the dark. For freedom is both gift and task, a promise whispered through the ages, and a question yet unanswered: how shall we use it? The war has ended. The cities are quiet now. The oaths are broken, the temples scarred. The fires that once raged through the Aegean world have dimmed into ash and memory. Only the sea remains unchanged, eternal, indifferent, and infinite. It washes over ruined harbors and forgotten graves, lapping gently at the shores of what was once great, what was once terrible, what was once alive. History, like the tide, comes and goes, but meaning lingers. Not in the marble ruins, not in the fading ink of treaties, but in us. For we, the distant children of that ancient war, still ask the same questions. What is honor? What is justice? Can power serve good or only itself? The Peloponnesian War did not end in clarity. There was no triumphant return, no golden age reborn. Athens fell, yes, but so did Sparta, slowly, silently, consumed by the very discipline that once made it immortal. In the end, both city-states vanished, but their ideas endured. They live in libraries, in constitutions, in silent classroom chalkboards and whispered bedtime stories. They live in every person who dares to speak freely, in every soul who questions authority, in every gathering where citizens, not kings, decide their future. This is the long exhale, the sacred hush after the storm, when memory becomes wisdom and sorrow becomes song. The Peloponnesian War is not just a chronicle of the past. It is a mirror held before us. It tells us, you will build, you will rise, you will fall. But if you remember, if you truly remember, you will also endure. There is no final victory, no eternal peace. But there is meaning, and there is story, and there is the quiet, trembling beauty of trying again. So sleep now, dear listener. Let the shields rest in the soil. Let the gods return to their heavens. Let the cities fade into mist, but let the lesson remain. That we are not alone in our struggles. That across centuries, across oceans, across ruins, others have asked the same questions we do now. Though they may not have answered them, they lived them, they suffered them. They dared to imagine something greater. So must we. The war is over. The stars are rising. And history, like the sea, waits patiently to whisper again to those willing to listen.